our speakers today, our first speaker is Fran Chismar and Tom Knezick. I'll get that right. Fran likes to talk, and with over 30 years of nursery industry experience, Fran has a lot to talk about. He insists he is not an expert on anything, but knows just enough about everything to be dangerous. Fran brings his experience with music, podcasting, and joins it with his industry knowledge in restoration of native plants. To help guide you through Native Plants' Healthy Planet, Fran is currently the Sultan of Sales at Pinelands Nursery in Columbus, New Jersey. Tom is naturally inquisitive, but his role as general manager and production analyst requires him to pull things apart and figure out how and why they work. Coupling this with growing up on a native plant nursery and his love of podcast is what makes Tom a natural host for Native Plants' Healthy Planet. Please join me in welcoming Fran and Tom.
Thank you, Rusty. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Fran Chismar, and as Rusty said, I'm the Sultan of Sales at Pinelands Nursery. I'm also the co-host of Native Plants Healthy Planet and also a Native Plant Every Day with Tom and Fran. And I'm here with Tom Knezick.
Yeah, and I'm Tom Knezick, and I'm the general manager at Pinelands Nursery and the other half of a Native Plant Healthy Planet. And really honored to be presenting to you guys today. It's amazing that people want to listen to us talk as often as we do, especially. So, and I saw a lot of familiar names in the attendees today, like Anthony Marinello and Rebecca McMacken, Mi Wu, who I've never met in person, but I'm glad to at least she can see me here today. And a handful of others. Todd Bradbury was another one, and so many more. So, Fran, we really can't screw this up because there's a lot of professionals that are really watching this and going to be judging us harshly. So,
and we don't have a lot of time either, so we gotta scooch on through.
Yeah. So the name of our presentation is "Bring on the Bugs: The Importance of Native Plants and How to Get Your Neighbors on Board." As many of you know, if you read "Bringing Nature Home" and "Nature's Best Hope" by Dr. Doug Tallamy, it's not just enough that what we're doing. Everyone really needs to chip in, and there's so many people who don't know how wonderful native plants are and really how important they are to everything that we want to accomplish as well. So that was what we were kind of thinking outside the box. How can we get more people on board with this native plant mission?
Yeah, because you can't always assume that everyone's on the same page or everyone understands everything that you understand or what we understand.
Or everyone's even interested.
Exactly.
So we're going to cruise through the first couple slides because that's really why this is important. And seeing who's on this this Zoom here, I think
we're
you already
to the
know.
choir.
You already know this part. But natural areas provide so many ecosystem services for us, but we're really losing our natural areas. So we look at the contemporary American home, and this is what, if you go through many housing developments in New Jersey, Long Island, upstate New York, you're going to see a lot of lawns that look like this.
Tom and I have done this presentation many times, and it's always scary because we flash this slide and we start seeing in the comments, oh, this is what I strive for.
Yeah,
this is
we
what
hashtag yard goals is one we get a lot. So, so we show this, and you guys know, well, there's really not a lot going on here from above an aesthetic perspective. If you're looking at things for pollinators or wildlife, there's not much here. It's kind of devoid.
There's a lot of non-natives. There are, I think that's a red maple, but it may be a cultivar. A lot of things that may look pretty or a lot of people see as pretty, which there's nothing wrong with their perception of that. But it's what a lot of people strive towards.
But that's okay because it's just 1 yard. Oh, you got a neighbor, so 2 yards. But this is more and more what our landscape is looking like, where you have many houses with the same amount of lawn, the same amount of impervious surface, the same trees, the same plants in the front yard, either non-native, a lot of them invasive on top of that. So, okay, but that's, even then, it's still okay because we have those other wild places to rely on.
We have parks.
Yeah. And this is what your parks are starting to look like. A lot of ball fields, a little bit of trees here and there.
Chemical treatments to keep the turf looking good for sports fields. And we do need these areas. They're important, but it's really fragmented. There's some trees, but it's, there's no understory. There's not a whole lot for pollinators.
But there's still those patches of woods and like that kind of thing. But then we have more development coming along. Whether if it's not houses, it tends to be warehousing and strip malls. And you're just creating more and more impervious surface, fragmenting those habitats even more. So, and there's still those little natural places, if you can call them that, left. But then especially, I know it's the same thing on Long Island as it is here in New Jersey. The deer pressure is just decimating those little patches of nature that we have left. And that just opens up for invasive plants, and you're losing so much biodiversity because of the overabundance of deer.
And we always like to point out, like, my children who are 19 and 21 look at this and go, this is a perfectly healthy forest. And Tom always says, like, you should be able to throw a tennis ball and not see it within 10 yards for a healthy forest. There's no understory. But this is all my kids know at this point. This isn't what I remember as a kid as a healthy forest. So that perception's even changing as to what people think is healthy and not.
Yeah. And this is our call to action, is when we typically give this presentation, we're usually spending a lot of time really dressing this up, but you guys know this, so we want to go through it quick. So now you look at this lawn again, or this yard, and you realize, oh, man, it's really not doing that much. Like, we see it, and yeah, it can look nice. It's aesthetically pleasing to us, but wildlife looks at it and sees something more like this.
An important component is always the food web. And it's if our native insects aren't interacting with that property, it's not really contributing to the food web.
Yeah. So say we look at that house, and that's our neighbor, that's next door. How do we get them involved with this as well? And because native plants really can be beautiful in the landscape. It's not something where, oh, that's only reserved for wild places, and nature is not here. Nature can be in your yard too, and it can look really nice as well. It's great for places that you don't want to mow, because if you have a little bit of a wet area, places that you're sick and tired riding on the lawnmower, put it there, make it a little meadow. It's a great place to start. So how do we convince those neighbors who are used to just that traditional landscape, the switching, or even just starting to incorporate some native plants?
To think about it. Yeah.
So yeah, we came up with some of our ideas, and that's what we're going to share. And we kind of break them up into 3 different levels. And you have your passive tactics, your active tactics, and we keep calling it aggressive because I keep forgetting to change the slide. It's more assertive is probably the right. We're actually stepping out and doing some more education and doing some things that might ruffle some feathers, but you're doing it in the right way where you're not turning people off. So passive techniques, many of you are already doing this stuff. Just having a nice looking garden. It's a garden like this is obviously not all native plants, but there's some natives incorporated in there, and just having something that's aesthetically pleasing is going to get people to walk through. Now, my garden at home is definitely not the nicest. I'm no landscape architect. Don't really know what I'm doing. I just kind of take plants we have left over at the end of the year and like, well, I think this will look good here, and put it there. But with COVID and more people using Facebook Marketplace to kind of trade goods, and I'm going to clean out the house and I'll put it on Facebook Marketplace, see if someone else can use it. We had so many people who would come up to our house to pick something up and say, oh, what's that flower there? That's really cool. Can you tell me the name? I want to write that down because I want to look that up and use it at home. So just having a nice looking garden can go a long way. So, and it happens in public places too. Having stuff, again, not all native here, but there's some natives mixed in. Having stuff that's going to catch people's eye is going to make them inquisitive and say, hey, that's something I think my sister might like that, or my mom might like that, or my wife might like that, or brother or husband, whatever. It's just something that'll catch their eye and say, oh, that's a really cool thing I might want to bring home. Another thing is borders. And this is not a great example of it, but it's an example nonetheless. Just having that kind of border where it's more approachable can go a long way.
More like a traditional landscape.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be, it can be wild without being completely wild.
Yeah, this is still a little wild. This is right in front of our office. Yeah. And the last was just having some signage it can go a long way. Just sometimes someone might see something and say, oh, that looks a little wild and crazy. But having a sign that then designates that, oh, this is pollinator habitat. Most people at least know that pollinators are beneficial. So,
and we've had some of our listeners really, and I can't remember if we discuss this later on, but just do some wonderful passive techniques where they've created a website of all the work they've done in their yard, and they just have a sign of the website in their front yard, or they've created maps where they allow people to walk through their property with a map and see what each plant is.
So then we get in some more active techniques. So this is a little bit more going out, maybe past your comfort zone, to educate people or entice them, or just straight up bait them into using native plants. So, and we kind of break these up in there's positive techniques and negative techniques. And some of the positive techniques are really just talking to your neighbors and not not chastising them or preaching them, but just having conversations with them.
You know, we had one listener say they were really redoing their front lawn, which was, they felt risky with all natives, and they talked to their neighbor and said, "This is what we're doing. Would you like us to put a border, you know, in between our yard and their yard?" And she said, "Yes." And she goes, it really converted that neighbor. She became active in that role in wanting to know what it was.
Yeah. And if you have, like I mentioned before, that nice looking kind of, not, I don't want to say manicured garden, but something that's aesthetically pleasing, you're going to start to be trusted as a source for this kind of information. And you talk to your neighbor and say, "Hey, I noticed that you had that nice purple flower in your front yard. And what was that?" "Oh, that was a New York aster. I have some seeds if you want, or I have some plants that I can share with you." And it'll just get that conversation going and maybe convince them to at least start thinking about native plants, if not even incorporating them. Complimenting your neighbors goes a long way. A lot better than saying, "Hey, you're really screwing things up over there with your Japanese barberry," even though they are.
And put that blower away.
Yeah.
You know, that's not helping.
Compliment what they do well.
And you can even use that as an intro. You can say, "Hey, I really enjoy that red flowering plant you put. You know what works really good? You know, if you like hummingbirds, you can plant a cardinal flower and you can have hummingbirds in your property." Like, you're not putting down what they are doing. You're complimenting them and adding to it.
Yeah. Or say something like, "Oh yeah, and I'm going to bring up a non-native example. They put in a Japanese maple in their yard. Oh, you know what? That's a beautiful tree you put in. It would really look good with maybe some Pennsylvania sedge, just like a green mulch around it. That could look really cool together." Again, you can offer plants. That's a great way to get them to at least take stuff. And that's suggesting things that they might like, especially if you have that rapport where they trust you as being someone who knows what they're talking about in regards to plants. Your opinion and your advice can sometimes go a long way in convincing them. Finding common ground is really, really important. Knowing what their interests are goes a long way, because they might not care about birds and insects and just flowers like many of us do. That's enough for us to start using native plants. Is, man, I want to see more butterflies, or I want to see more birds, or I want to see I want to know I'm contributing to ecology.
And they may not care at all, but they may care about a pretty looking property.
Yeah.
And that's enough to appeal to.
They might care about scuba diving or fishing.
Yeah.
And now, by having native plants in your yard, you're cleaning the water that's eventually going to end up in those places, going to end up in our oceans, going to end up in our waterways. And that may be the conversion.
Or maybe they like seeing deer in their property.
I was thinking, when Heather Holm was talking earlier, I'm thinking about squash bees for some reason. And I'm like, yeah, they might like Halloween. And if they know, okay, well, Halloweens or pumpkins are relying on squash bees, not that what's in your garden is really going to help. But if you have a vegetable garden, having native plants around is really going to help the pollination in your vegetable garden too. So they might not know that if you want pumpkins, you need squash bees to pollinate those flowers. And those are native bees. And a lot of other native bees are relying on native plants. You got to find what they're interested in and then tie it into their interests. Tying it into your interests is not going to usually bring them in unless they're also interested in those things. Some ideas of negative reinforcement. Now, I just learned something new. I usually show a carton of cigarettes as a good example, because many of you, if you've been to the store and you see the cigarettes, it says that Surgeon General warning on the front. Other countries have taken it a lot further and gone and put like pictures of what your
rotting teeth
gums may look like and teeth may look like. But then I read the book Atomic Habits recently, and they were saying a lot of times that doesn't work, because people see the package of cigarettes and say, "Oh, that makes me want a cigarette," if they're a smoker. So I took that out, even though I just told you all about it anyway. But many of you probably remember this from this Whole Foods ad a couple years ago about the importance of bees. And they say, this is your produce choices when you have bees. This is what happens when you don't. When they put this out, not a lot of people can imagine the grocery store looking like this. Now we kind of can, because that happened in 2020.
Yes, it did.
So what are some other things that we can do? You guys are probably a lot more creative than we are. What are some other things we can do like that to present native plants in a positive light, but also say, hey, this is what happens if we don't have native plants, and if we don't have those insects or birds that are so reliant on these native plants. Kind of, I don't want to say scare people into action, but yeah, motivate them to make a change because they're potentially really excited or afraid of the consequences. Some other strategies for some active roles you can take. just bragging on social media.
One of the examples we gave when we were talking with Kyle Leibarger of Native Plant Talk was, so many people like will post videos of their neighbors using blowers and say how stupid they are and things like that. We started doing videos saying we just did a whole lot of work to set up good habitat for insects over the winter, and you pan over and it's just leaves on the yard, on the lawn. But you go into all the benefits, all the things like that, and then, hey, instead of raking leaves, I'm spending the day in my hammock.
Yeah.
And it's, and you're preaching the positives instead of putting down other people's interests.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure many of you are also like affiliated with Wild Ones chapters or native plant societies or the Wildlife Society, different outdoor groups that kind of relate back to native plants and native habitats in a way. Bring friends to your meetings. Yeah, they might feel guilty the first couple times, and if it's not for them, maybe they'll stop going. But it might open them up to something, just because maybe they were interested already, but they weren't going because they didn't know they knew someone there. And just inviting them and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to this for the first time. I've been going this. I think you'd really be interested in it. Why don't you come along? They have free pizza.
I was going to say, tie it in with a trip for food, like offered a treat for dinner.
When you know your friends and neighbors and family's interests, it can be really easy to share articles with them, because now they're like, I'll bring up the fishing example before. You have someone that's interested in fishing, you find an article that's about how they were in South Jersey, they're increasing all this fish breeding habitat for striped bass. Striped bass is obviously a big game fish. There's tons of people love to fish for striped bass. You share an article that's showing how important these salt marshes are for striped bass spawning and recruitment. Man, that might get them involved and say, well, okay, we need more salt marsh.
Yeah.
And then maybe they get more active in those kind of things. And then if you don't have a place or if you do have a place, sometimes working in public places can go a long way. Your local parks and common community areas, you get more eyes seeing that kind of stuff.
There's a lot of great nonprofits, places like for us, Sourlands Conservancy, things like that you can get involved and meet other people with similar interests.
Yep. And then you can drag your friends along to help you too. These are some more aggressive techniques or assertive techniques, more going a little bit more out of your comfort zone than that last step. You're becoming more vocal and more of a face out there. This is not the example I'm going to say to do, but how many people have gotten something like this in their mailbox? And I blacked out all the names. I don't want to promote or disparage a certain company because of this, but how many? I've gotten a ton.
I've gotten a ton, and some of my neighbors actually use these services, but they don't realize that, you can't put a sign up telling the good insects not to come in. 24-hour reentry, don't come in.
Yeah.
It's affecting everything. They're not just targeting mosquitoes, fleas. A lot of the times, it eliminates and repels 34 insects. How many of those are beneficial?
Yeah. So, but everyone in your block has gotten this, maybe even this exact flyer numerous times. And if not this flyers that are similar from a different company. So we're getting all this constant feed of information about how we should be spraying for mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks. If we want to keep them away, we need to spray.
Yeah.
That's the information that's coming in. How many people have gotten some mailer that says, hey, don't spray for mosquitoes?
Hey, if you reduce standing water on your property, you can reduce the amount of mosquitoes on your property.
Yeah, those kind of things where it's now providing information to the contrary, where they're getting information that I'm sure many of us agree with and know to be true from our own experience in our own backyards. Little tips and techniques on a mailer. Now, the reason why this hasn't happened is there's no big financial motivation to send that out. You're saying, oh, do less.
And there's not, and one of our attendees saying, how do you get people to care? The problem is too, the people with the money have the loudest voice. Now they're considered sometimes by the consumer an expert because they were the first one and the loudest to do it. So how do you combat that? It's very difficult.
Yeah. And I know we're getting a little close on time, if not over time already, but some of the tips that we've found for mosquitoes, so mosquito, and then you have the conventional method. But then this is what'll happen sometimes is you're hitting non-target species. You're hitting butterflies, caterpillars, moths, anything or bees, you're hitting all that as well. It's not like they said, oh, we're going to get out of here. So it's just the mosquitoes and ticks, like Fran said.
And there's research that backs that as well.
So it's hurting your birds when you do that. It's hurting a lot of your other beneficial insects when you do that. even if they aren't directly affected by the spray, which a lot of times they are, they're out of a food source at least for a period of time. Not that the dragonfly is necessarily eating at that time in that life stage, but those kind of
Bats,
things
yeah.
are reliant on those mosquitoes. And you can do other things by getting rid of standing water, like Fran said. Using a fan when you're outside is a great way to keep a lot of those pesky insects away.
Chickens.
So yeah,
You know, I read an incredible article about how Disney World, there are no mosquitoes on their property, and they don't spray because they knew it wouldn't be safe for guests, but they planned accordingly to make sure there were no mosquitoes.
but yeah, you have the right plants there, you're going to attract a lot of these beneficial insects, and that'll take care of a lot of your pest insects as well. This happened in Jersey City, not too far away, or kind of in between Long Island and us, where they made this big giant mural. This got a ton of press, in addition to all the people who saw it driving by or walking by. This is a big, bold statement. Again, it takes money to contract this and do this, but what a message it sends by having something that big that then got published all the way across the country about, look at this amazing mural. Some other strategies we kind of mentioned some was bulk mailers. Having a roadside up front at least sends a message.
Yeah.
Like I'm just saying, like the political ones, and just one as simple as it says plant native plants can go a long way, because it'll at least get one or two people thinking as they drive by and say, oh, what's a native plant at the very least. Art projects, booths at events, government policy is really important. I know that's something Limpy does, I think, a fair amount of as well, is getting involved at least at your municipal level, if not your state level, county level, or federal level, because that is really, really important. Some of the policy can dictate what people are allowed and not allowed to do.
Yeah.
So, and if you aren't making your voice heard, then a lot of times they just don't know you have a voice, and there is that concern.
I give you a 3-minute warning.
Oh,
All right.
perfect.
Okay.
Because I think we got like 2 or 3 left. So
All right.
things you shouldn't do: don't call your neighbor an idiot. That is going to make them maybe get a little spiteful and start planting more invasive plants in spite of you because they're angry at what you're saying. So don't talk down to people is another one. We try and avoid getting, although we've just preached about this for the last half hour, but we try to say, hey, let's not preach to people and say, this is why it's important, this is why you need to do it. You have to engage them and bring them along. It's like kind of the marketing strategy. It's a lot easier to drag the spaghetti noodle across the piece of paper than push it across. So, I just said it, don't act all preachy. Don't go rogue on other people's property.
We know people who have.
Reaching across the fence to spray something and all that kind of stuff. I know people who've done it. It's going to end up poorly in the long run. Don't argue on Facebook unless you're right or the other person's an idiot. Those are the only times you can actually do it. That's a little joke for anyone who's paying attention. And try not to complain. That's the big thing. Is complaining is going to turn people away from your message versus enticing them to come into it. And then definitely, Fran really likes to bring this one up. Don't hold other people to your standards.
No, we all are on this journey, and no one is born and says, "Hey, I'm vegan." You know, you open your eyes over time, and everyone's at different stages of the journey, and it doesn't help when people tell you to do something, but when you understand and learn why to do something. So just remember, someone else is just maybe starting the journey when you're in the middle of the journey, and be cognizant of that, and just help them along the journey.
And think about why they're doing it the way they're doing it. Where did they learn this information from? Is it from mailers and friends that are landscapers that don't understand the benefits of the plant? Maybe their parents are a gardener and they love Rosa Sharon, so they love Rosa Sharon too. Yeah. Where are they learning this kind of stuff? It's online gardener groups. I'm seeing all kinds of information that are anti-native plants in a lot of cases.
Is it the status quo?
Are they looking at their neighbors? Are their neighbors using native plants at home? Or their public spaces where they're using native plants? Landscapers, do they know that there are alternatives that are ecologically sound and beautiful at the same time? So, Fran, I'll let you take this quote.
Adopt the pace of nature. Her secret is patience. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Patience is virtue. It's not going to happen overnight. It all takes time. It took us time to get to where we're at. Allow everyone to have that time. Nature takes time. Yeah. It's patience.
All right.
Patience, which is difficult sometimes.
So here's all our shameless plugs. Here's our website. I know a lot of you are already familiar with it. It's something I built 2 years ago. I'm really proud of. Here's our podcast information. These are really old. Our episode, we just hit episode 100 that's going to release tomorrow. We have a YouTube channel where we try and put a lot of stuff up. And then we're selling these shirts through the podcast as well. And you can actually, if nativeplants.healthyplant.com, you can find these as well. But this is a way we're taking all the money we're making off these shirts, all the profits, other than what we pay for the shirts, and we're giving them to some of these nonprofits that really have done some amazing work and are doing boots on the ground stuff, doing some planting that a couple $100 can really, really help them out. So,
Awesome.
and it spreads a great message too. It's a way to be active and promote native plants by wearing things that say native plants on them. All right, that's all we have.
Thank
I
you
think
so much.
We did okay.
That's the
time-wise.
quickest we've ever done it.
So Rusty, we'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, you're a minute over, but that's not so bad as what I was this morning, so I'm feeling pretty good. Okay. So thank you, Fran and Tom. Our next speaker is Dr. Anthony Cullen. Dr. Cullen is a plant community ecologist who focuses on invasive species. While a PhD candidate at Rutgers University, Newark, his research investigated dispersal and distribution of two invasive viburnum shrubs, Viburnum dilatum, linden viburnum, and Viburnum sieboldii, Siebold's viburnum. Anthony employed an interdisciplinary approach that incorporated spatial modeling and landscape genetics with field-based ecology experiments. He is excited to talk to Lisma about the research and building resilience communities on Long Island. And I am personally very much looking forward to this talk. Please welcome Dr. Tony Cullen.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to assume that you'll be able to see it. But if not, just let me know. So it should be up now and I'm going to get going on the presentation. So I'm going to take a different tilt on natives by start talking about invasives. So my work is exploring how horticultural specimens have kind of escaped the bounds of their gardens. And I want to tell you a little bit about my story to get to my research because it really informs the work I do. So, you know, my love of plants and science really came from two formative experiences in my youth and my, you know, my teens and my 20s, which was I worked at a greenhouse, a local greenhouse by me, and I, you know, schlepped a lot of trees and shrubs into people's car and probably sold my fair share of non-native shrubs in my time. And then, you know, my other formative experiences was exploring New Jersey and hiking around and seeing all the different plants and communities and trying to learn those plants. I really always had a knack for kind of plant traits and what made a certain plant, you know, I knew what species that was based on certain attributes. So I've always really loved plants from very early on. And so one thing I started noticing as I was hiking around New Jersey is that a lot of the parks that I used to like to go to that were close to me, like Morristown National Historic Park, you know, had these old estates next to them. This is a picture of the Cross Garden Estates. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. You know, and they have these manicured English gardens and these wisteria trellises, which hopefully you're rolling your eyes because wisteria is pretty invasive. You know, and so, you know, this trend continued as I was expanding my hiking radius and going to new parks. Out near Hackle-Barney Park in New Jersey, there's the Willowwood Arboretum, which again was an old estate. You know, a lot of people use, a lot of wealthy folks had summer mountain houses out in the country, and they had these, you know, really ornate gardens. And, you know, here's another example of green wooden gardens near South Mountain Reservation. And one thing I really started to notice is that, you know, and this is no surprise to anybody on this call, right, is that the plants that I was seeing at these gardens were also some of the same plants that I was seeing outside of the gardens. You know, it didn't take me long to realize that there was a real big problem with having a lot of these ornamental and exotic shrubs. And so just to give you context, you know, because this is for Long Island, so folks that might not be as familiar, you know, what the parks I was talking about are mostly in Morris County, New Jersey, and some in Essex County, New Jersey. There's Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge and Morristown National Historic Park. And you can see that right around there, there's Frelinghuysen Arboretum, Willowwood Arboretum, arboretum, across the state gardens, Greenwood Gardens, there's reeves, there's a whole lot more that I didn't include here, but you get the picture. So when we think about ornamental plants and what makes them, desirable, it's often showy fruit and flowers, right? People want to have beautiful flowers in the yard. They want to have beautiful fruit, especially if it attracts other wildlife like birds feeding on the berries. But as we know, right, that a lot of the same things that make something a great ornamental also probably make it a great invasive plant. So if you have a large flower, like a compound flower, you're probably going to also have a lot of seeds or fruit. And if that fruit is attractive to mammals or birds, they're going to spread that fruit. And maybe not every non-native plant will volunteer, but a subset will. And these could be your next potential invaders, right? So, some of our old favorites, and by favorites, I hope everybody's rolling their eyes because have come over in the mid 1800s, early 1900s. So, at one time, Japanese knotweed was thought of as a pretty plant and a desirable thing to have in your garden. Same thing with Japanese barberry or burning bush, right? And now these are all the same plants that we see in our forest understory and our riparian corridors, right? So what I want to talk to you about today is a little bit about my work, and this is not my paper, by the way. I shouldn't sell it as, but it should be no surprise that like this paper found that the majority of invasive plants have been horticultural pathways, right? And so I want to talk to you today a little bit about my research and what I looked at. And so the two plants that I focus on, you might start noticing in your understories or in your local parks are Viburnum dilatatum, which is also known as linden viburnum, and Viburnum sieboldi, which is Siebold's viburnum. So both of these are distributed mostly in the New York, New Jersey area, with some in Pennsylvania and maybe Virginia and Maryland. But then it starts to really scatter. But there are populations of Viburnum dilatatum in about 10 states. And Viburnum sieboldi, I think the latest count was about 13 states. So this has changed. When I first started my research, I think it was 7 and 10, right? So more states have been at it. And, like a lot of invasive species, they come over from, Asia. In this case, Viburnum dilatatum has distributions in China and Korea and Japan, where Viburnum sieboldi is really actually only located on the island of Japan. So my previous work, it really focused on looking at the fruit and what made the fruit attractive to birds, in the hopes of finding out what birds are dispersing this and why. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is something entirely different. It's a landscape genetics project that I've been working on, and I have a small little project going that I kind of want to discuss today. So we know that both of these species have been around for a while, at least as early as the 1850s or as late as the 1880s. And we start seeing in the literature that they started colonizing in the late 70s, early 80s. And they haven't really become naturalized probably in the last 10 or 12 years. So when I say newly invasive, they've been here a while, but they really haven't started making an impact until I'd say the last 10 or 12 years. And so when we think about species coming over, I want to focus folks on the founder effect. And the founder effect simply is that when you have a population and you have a lot of different alleles in that population, and say some botanist was over in Japan and he took these species because he thought they're really cool, which is the case in these. Viburnum sieboldi is named after von Sieboldi, who was a physician and a botanist and spent some time in Japan. So when we bring these species over, we don't bring the whole population, right? We bring a subset of that population. And so what happens is often these species have what we call a genetic bottleneck, which simply means is that there's not as much genetic diversity that they have in their introduced range as they had in their home range. right? And so what I was really interested in was looking at kind of gene flow among the population. So I had parks from, you know, Long Island and in the city all the way down to Philadelphia, basically along the I-95 corridor, because that's mainly where I found these distributed. And, you know, I wanted to look at the genetic diversity of the populations in those parks and those arboretums. So you don't have to focus too much on this, other to say is that, you know, we really focused our sampling in local parks throughout that I-95 corridor. And we also took samples from local botanical gardens and arboretums because we wanted to see, like, are these plants that we're finding in our parks, are they volunteering, you know, from our local beloved, you know, botanical gardens or arboretums? It's a real problem. Some arboretums have been very proactive and they've removed a lot of these species, but in a lot of cases, the damage is already done. So we had field sites, many field sites for both Dilatatum and Sieboldii. But for this study, we took a subsample to just kind of get a feel for what was going on there. So I don't want to overwhelm you with too much technical jargon, but basically there's two ways we can measure how populations are changing over time. And one's called AMOVA, or analysis of molecular variance. And basically you have, what it puts out is an FST value. So let's focus on that. So when an FST value is 1, it means that the populations are distinct. There's population A only has the blue allele, population B only has the purple allele, but they don't share any common characteristics. So we say that the variation among the population is 100%. They're totally different. Variation within the population is 0. There's no variation because they all have the same allele. Now the opposite end is, it could be, the FST value could be 0. And among that, the allele distribution would be evenly distributed. So we could say that the variation among the populations A and B, there is no variation. They look the same when we look at the alleles. But within, you know, there is variation because they have 2 different alleles, you know. But mostly when we're doing this type of work, it's not a all or nothing type thing. You know, you might find that population A has 4 of the blue and 2 of the purple, and population B has 2 of the blue and 4 of the purple, right? And so this is really, you know, shows that there's some genetic differentiation between populations, if that makes sense. Sorry if it's getting too jargony. Another way we can measure this is looking at what we call Tajima's D. And don't focus on the chart. All you really need to know is that if Tajima's D is a positive number, it means that population is contracting, right? That it probably went through a bottleneck, or it's still going through a genetic bottleneck. And if it's negative, it means that the population is recovering, right? So FST value tells us the genetic diversity in the population. Tajima's D tells us if populations are recovering from that initial genetic bottleneck. And if you forget what I'm talking about, think back to that slide of the ship and the plants coming over, okay? So what we found is pretty cool, is that we see that with V. dilatatum, that while there's a lot of populations are the same, there's not a lot of variation, that there are starting to show distinct population. So like we see that, like, plants sampled at Frelinghuysen Arboretum and Cunningham Park in New York are more closely related than some other viburnum that are found in the same park in Cunningham and New York Botanical Garden, and all the way down at Washington Crossing down near Philadelphia, or near Trenton, I should say, right? And so we see that the population of V. dilatatum is starting to differentiate. And if you look at the Tajima's D, remember, if it's negative, it means that it's working its way out of that bottleneck. The population is recovering. So we see that the genetic diversity is starting to increase in our V. dilatatum populations. But if you look at V. sieboldii, we just have one large group. Now, granted, this is a small subset, but you can see there's just no genetic diversity. If you look back at the first node, they're all connected. It's what's known as a polytomy, which just means that there's multiple branches on one node. And so there's just no genetic diversity. And there's reasons that we think that that might be the case. And we also see when we look at Tajima's D, remember about the genetic bottleneck, it's a high positive number. So Viburnum sieboldii is not really recovering from it coming over all those years ago. But both are successful invaders. So kind of want to break down what I think is going on. There's really two factors. The first being is that Viburnum dilatatum is a small shrub, and it reaches sexual maturity a lot quicker. So not only can it intermix quicker than sieboldii, which is a large shrub that probably takes a longer time to mature, but also, if you go back to your basic genetics, it also has more time to build up mutations, right? And Viburnum dilatatum has way more cultivars than Viburnum sieboldii. Viburnum sieboldii has about 2 cultivars, where Viburnum dilatatum, depending on who you ask, has anywhere from 9 to, I think, 16, I want to say. Maybe it's 13. No, 16. So a lot of different cultivars, a lot of different admixture that can happen. So if you have different cultivars sitting in these horticultural spaces, if one of those mixes makes its way out and it's successful, spread by a bird eating the berry, that's all you really need. So I just want to sum up, because I know I'm running out of time. We see that with one of the smaller shrub dilatatum, that they're diversifying, expanding, and maybe recovering, and sieboldii is not. But sieboldii is just as successful, and it might be just that sieboldii relies more on clonal growth, where dilatatum doesn't. It relies more on seed dispersal. But it's a really small subsample, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But we feel like it's a good baseline. So kind of to tie it back into this section is that, we have a lot of great natives in our tri-state area, right? And especially when you think about viburnum, the viburnum you find native is a wonderful resource, and it looks identical to a lot of the non-natives. So in my mind, it doesn't make sense. Not only do they have the same showy flowers and they attract pollinators, but the fruit, from our earlier work, we know that with one of our collaborators, Dr. Susan Smith-Pagano, is that the fruit is just more nutritious for birds. That dark, rich fruit has more energy for migrating birds and more fat, right? So, there's a lot of arguments to be made over using natives, and viburnum is just a small, limited case, but we can find cohorts that of natives that are the exact same family as invasives and really promote using them. So with that, we've come full circle. I like this picture. I didn't even plan it. There's no way I could. There's me, in my late teens, working at a horticultural area, and this is me probably about 5 years ago. Same shirt. I could still fit in it 20 years later. Also, working at trying to unravel the mystery of how these invasive horticultural species make it out into our parks. So I just wanted to thank, and we're not going to name everybody because it would take too long, but it had a lot of great parks and collaborators working with me, from colleges and universities to national parks and refuges and state parks, and it's been wonderful. And of course, Rutgers University and NJIT for supporting me, and all the different fellowships like Torrey Botanical and Ecological Society of America, and then Garden Club of America, and then just all these different folks who were integral to the research. And I know I don't have time for questions now, but I will take some later when the time comes. So thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. Our next speaker is Chris Neill. Chris is an ecologist and senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and former director of the Ecosystem Center of the Marine Biological Laboratory. He studies the consequences of deforestation and expanding agriculture in the Brazilian Amazon, and works with land managers on biodiversity and management and restoration of grasslands, shrublands, and wetlands in coastal Massachusetts. Chris collaborates on a national project that examines how the way homeowners manage their yards influences the ecological functions in yards and neighborhoods. He also oversees laboratory analysis for the Buzzards Bay Coalition, Bay Watchers program that has been monitoring changes to water quality in Buzzards Bay estuary since 1992. Please welcome Chris. And Chris, you're muted. There you go.
There, I'll turn my little camera on. So thank you. No, this is great. So I think my role here is to talk about more the landscape scale. If you go back to the title of this session. So I'm an ecologist, and I'm interested in land use, how humans influence land use. And I do work in different parts of the world, but I live in suburbia, and I'm very interested in how the choices we make about yards influence the structure of residential ecosystems. And almost 10 years ago now, I got together with a bunch of my colleagues around the country thinking about these questions. And let's see, page, oh, there we go. It's just a little bit slow here. And we posed a question to ourselves, right? Most of us live near universities, research institutes, and we live in similar habitats. And at one of these meetings where we were brainstorming about, well, we do something to look at the ecological functions of lawns, but do it at a continental scale. National Science Foundation had just started this program they call macro systems biology, where you're supposed to look at things at very large scales. And I flashed up this picture to my colleagues. I said, can you identify what city is what? And people pondered it. Well, here the left is Boston, the right is Phoenix. But what struck us was the similarities in the structure of these ecosystems. And we thought, we shouldn't just be looking at lawns, we should be looking at the way people manage entire yards and look at it from the perspective of a whole host of ecosystem functions that range from the biogeochemical cycling of elements like nitrogen, which are very important because they get into our waters and cause eutrophication, to the storage of carbon, to food webs in residential ecosystems. So what we define this as a residential macro system. And we kind of asked the question in the first phase of our project, and I'm going to talk about the first phase and then the second phase, which is kind of more focused on how we might be able to nudge this system in the middle of the picture here, towards something that's more ecologically functional. And but we came up with this question. Look, cities across the US, and we ended up with 6 cities in this study: Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And all of these systems, originally were carved out of the regional native ecosystems. In Boston, in the Northeast, deciduous forest; Baltimore, another eastern forest ecosystem; Miami, it was more coastal scrub; Phoenix, the Northern Desert; LA, desert scrub; Minneapolis, St. Paul, the border between the prairie and the eastern forest. And came up with this idea that we wanted to test, that urban land use is homogenizing the entire continental US, right? This 10 to 15%, how you define it, that we now think of as residential landscapes across the US, producing residential ecosystems that are more similar to each other than to the natural ecosystems they replace. So we spent some time thinking about, well, how are these residential systems structured? Let's make some measurements of these things, provide some hard data on what their structure is, and then compare them to the native systems. So we also wanted to understand, well, what is human motivation in these systems? So we did a survey. We called, had a survey company call about one of those annoying calls, about 10,000 people across all these cities. And we asked them questions about why they did what they do in their yards in the context of these ecosystem services. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about that study in a second. The other thing we did was we went out and we actually made measurements in yards. We're interested in soils, we're interested in trees, plant species lists. So here's me in a yard. We took soil cores down to 1 meter with this device that we then had to jack up with an auto jack, and we had to go around called dig safe everywhere because we didn't want to hit anything buried underneath there. But the idea was we want to do the same measurements across 6 cities in multiple yards, several hundred yards across. several hundred residences across all the cities, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of homogenization, that we're pushing everything to this kind of homogenized, humanized, savanna-like landscape that that Fran and Tom, showed a very nice picture of and made a very good point about. So take the idea that there's a natural nitrogen supply in native ecosystems, right? That nitrogen is coming from organic. It comes from decomposing organic matter. It moves through ammonium. Sometimes it's nitrified. That puts it in a form where it might be lost. But the idea here is that across all these systems, there's a very wide range in the natural nitrogen supply. So in each of these cities, we're also out there looking at those native ecosystems from whence originally those urbanized suburban systems came. So here, very wide range in natural nitrogen supply. But look, 50 to 70% of everybody everywhere fertilizes their lawn in the US. That's one of the things we got from the survey. So we've taken a very uneven, lots of variation amongst the natural systems, and we've kind of homogenized it, right? We regard this as strong evidence for homogenization. We've created a similar nitrogen biogeochemistry in residential areas across the country just by our habits, right? The other thing we did was we asked people, do you like your yard and why do you like it? And I don't expect you to look at all these results other than to show that 10 means they like their yards a lot and 0 means they don't like their yards at all. Everybody, all of these are highly skewed towards, I really like my yard. And we want to know why. So what did they answer? And I'm interested in this because I study watersheds and I'm interested in how land use affects multiple things at large scales. And we did a survey. We said, rank 1 to 3. Do you like your yard? Is it important? Is this characteristic important? No, 1, yes, 3. And here's what ranked highest. Creates a beautiful yard, provides personal enjoyment, easy to maintain. Those everywhere across the whole country, those came up. Some evidence that people care about supporting wildlife, less that they care about native plants, and absolutely no evidence that they care one bit about reducing pollution to local water, helps with climate change. Those sort of the bigger picture things. So the preferences are all sort of highly localized. Well, I think that provides us some insight in how we relate to people, right? Tom and Fran were talking about just neighbor to neighbor. This is evidence that that's what drives decisions and what yards look like. Obviously, maybe not rocket science, but it confirms that this is where people are at when they're making these decisions. The other thing we did in this project that I think is more relevant here, and I like talking about because I'm really a plant person, is how do these choices that people make in their yards structure the plant communities in yards? Plant communities in yards are very, very interesting, right? And there are all these different parts of yards, and they have different components here, like, there's a lawn, there's a little vegetable or herb garden, flower garden, and then, there's kind of the back area that's still kind of wooded, but yet somewhat influenced. So we did wall-to-wall surveys in all the yards of all the plant species, and we classified them as to whether they were native or non-native. And we classified them as to whether they were on a scale of 1 to 3, as best we could tell, whether they were spontaneous, that is, they got there by themselves without humans planting them, or they're cultivated, that is, obviously human planted, a specimen tree in the middle of the yard, for example. And so, some of them were in gray areas, but we made our guesses as to what they were. And here, if you look across the whole country, we thought this was interesting. This is like the first survey of the entire, sort of scope of the continent. What's the flora of yards? And well, it turns out, they are, this is at the grand scale what it looks like, right? These are natural areas, 100 species of plants in the plots we surveyed, in yards, there were across the country, we found about, say 900 or so species total that, a little over 200 species were spontaneous and about, 450 were cultivated. So the cultivated species are obviously dominating. Lawns count as a lot of cultivated species, right? Those grasses wouldn't be there otherwise. If you break this down further, we get a little more insight. This is a plot for all the cities. This is Baltimore, Boston, LA, etc. Here are the reference ecosystems over here, right? Highly dominated by spontaneous. Everything is spontaneous. Humans aren't planting out in forested parks. They're either native or non-native, right? But in yards, it's a mix. You've got these spontaneous non-native, say for Boston here, non-native things that came in. A lot of spontaneous things coming up in yards that are native plants coming in from adjacent areas. And then a lot of cultivated non-natives, but some cultivated natives. And if you look across the whole country, this is the distribution of those plant types. So to us, it's just a lot of evidence that this cultivated block here, there's an awful lot of room for making change in what is in yards based on what's there already. The other thing we did was we measured the diameters of trees in all the yards, and I'm just going to talk about Boston here. But one of the more interesting findings I thought from this was that here's the DBH, the diameter breast height of trees in Boston. Here's the total proportion of trees. The green bars are in our natural areas. These are, say, big parks around Boston, Boston, like the Blue Hills, some big Mass Audubon reserves. But here are the residential areas. The interesting thing, two interesting things about the distribution of how trees in suburban, residential landscapes compare with trees in natural landscapes in the Boston metro area was that two things. One is the residential areas had more big trees. And if you're interested in global change in carbon storage like I am, that's interesting because big trees hold a disproportionately large amount of carbon, right? The carbon storage is the cube of the, of the diameter, right? Rather than, so a little change in DBH in a big tree is a big increase in carbon. The other thing is, that they're mostly much higher proportion of non-native trees, things like Norway maple and the sycamore maples were big. Red oak is also big in Boston, but a lot of non-native. But look at this, percent of carbon in big trees over 45 centimeter DBH. In residential areas, it was 54% of the total. In residential, in native forests, it was only 13%. So those big trees in residential landscapes are really important in terms of structure and carbon. All right, phase 2 of this project. We had so much fun with this group that we got another macrosystems grant from NSF a few years ago, and we switched gears a little bit, but we still love this approach of going into yards and measuring stuff. We decided that we would have multiple treatments. Now, by treatments, we didn't go out and manipulate yards. We just took yards that had been managed in different ways. And one of those ways was these high input lawns, right? This is like, you hire a lawn company and you manage for mostly lawn. Low input lawn, you don't hire a landscape company, you manage everything yourself and you manage it with much lower levels of inputs of fertilizer and herbicides, right? The other treatment we had was water conservation. Now, this didn't end up being a really big deal in Boston because there's a lot of water and we don't have giant runoff problems. And so there aren't a lot of these sort of swales and things in yards. So we didn't, I'm not going to talk about too much of this from Boston, but then we had this very important one was wildlife friendly, people who intentionally manage their yards for habitat for native things. That often meant putting more plants, but the key was here providing wildlife habitat, providing a little water, providing cover and structure. And these were all certified by the National Wildlife Federation. They have a national program for this. We got their lists and we picked at random some of these properties from their list. And we stratified all of this always sort of within the same income and density zones so that we're not looking at wildly disparate kinds of yards. And then we looked at what we call interstitial or fragmented parks. These are small, sort of conservation lots mostly within and bordered by neighborhoods, and then bigger reference parks, which were, sort of 1,000-acre parks often that were bigger municipal or NGO or state-owned conservation areas, right? And we studied responses of birds. I'm going to talk about responses of birds and invertebrates and plants. All right, first plants. All right, so we surveyed the species richness of plants across all these yards, and we ran these are sort of species accumulation curves. It's a nice way of showing that as you increase the number of plots that you survey or number of yards that you survey, you increase, this is for the whole country, you increase the number of species that you find. And lo and behold, the wildlife yards, when people are intentionally managing for plant richness, among other things, you get greater plant richness. It's kind of nice to see, but not totally unexpected. And then these other plots kind of fell out as expected, right? That wildlife is by far the greatest diversity, but then it's the lesser intensity, and the higher intensity lawn managed focused yards have fewer species, much less species richness. And then the reference sites are in all cases lower. I mean, humans are the driving force here, right? It's not a surprise to any of you, but here's very solid evidence for that, changing things at the continental scale. All right, so birds, we just had a paper come out on birds. We did point counts in all of these yards and all the cities in the spring. And, we looked at birds, the native birds, as I'm just showing some from the Northeast, catbirds, towhees, yellowthroats, and then sort of non-native birds like European starlings. And again, we're trying to figure out, does managing for wildlife or does the kind of management a yard have influenced the makeup of the bird community in yards? And then, of course, we're plotting this against the parks, the regional parks, or the smaller, sort of pocket conservation areas or non-developed areas. And here again are our treatments: high density, low density, water yards nationally, wildlife yards. And here's the treatments, right? Again, the land management. And this is just the change in richness from the mean richness nationally. So parks had more birds, interstitial parks had more birds. Not a lot of statistical difference in the bird communities in any kind of yard, but the trend is definitely there, right? More species richness in the wildlife yards. And the reason for the less, so the trend is kind of going in the right direction, but it's not definitive in the sense that a lot more is controlling the bird community than just one yard that's managed as one yard. Here goes back to the need to get neighbors on board to change neighborhoods and larger landscapes, because birds are just not responding. There was a little bit of a hint that they're responding at the yard scale, but they're probably really responding to a much larger scale. Not so with the smaller stuff. So here we went out and we put pitfall traps. Here's just an example, little hole in the ground, and things fall in. We left them there for 24 hours, went out and got them. And we looked at all this amazing array of ground fauna. Again, at the national scale, we can break this down by city, but the trends were pretty consistent for this stuff across the US. And that is, this is, the reference sites had way more ground invertebrates, interstitial less, but also high. The high maintenance had the least, the low maintenance a little bit more, and the wildlife was going in the right direction. So you actually made it by diversifying your yard, changing the structure, you actually increase the ground flora, ground fauna, invertebrate fauna, but not back. You haven't pushed it all the way back. Maybe that's not a surprise, but it's going in the right direction. So it makes a difference what you do in terms of management. Bees were also interesting.
Chris, we need to, a minute or two is all we have left.
Okay.
So we have time for questions. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we did bees, and the story for bees was a little bit different. And that is the, in Boston, the wildlife yards by far had more bees. You're putting a lot of pollinators in the landscape by human planting, and the reference areas had less. But if you go out to the west, where there's a rich native bee fauna, the residential areas had way more, but wildlife yards are headed right in the right. You make a big difference by having wildlife plantings compared with a sort of more intensive yard management. So I'll skip that because I'm running out of time. The last point I wanted to make was a lot of this evidence, people mentioned Doug Tallamy. We had working with us one of Doug Tallamy's former PhD students, who was Desiree Narango. And I'm just going to show two simple results from her studies, which I think were really path-breaking. One is, if you look at caterpillars, spiders, you look at arthropods that are, in yards, the numbers go down the more native plants you have. The numbers are higher with more native plants, less with non-native plants. And she linked this up the food web, which I think was super cool, to birds, right? These are Carolina chickadees. This was done around DC, that the more non-native plants you have, the less successful chickadees are. I think just a really, really nice example. So we talk a lot about the reasons we need native plants. Here's a really, a really careful scientific, demonstration of how these change food webs and why planting for diverse yards with native plants actually works its way through invertebrates up into the bird food web in yards. So take-home message from all of this science, I think, we can sum up a bunch of things: more canopy cover, more vegetation structure. The things you would do to make a wildlife-friendly yard do make a big difference, a measurable difference, city by city across the continent. Increasing that structure, doing things like mowing less, make a big difference. Plant native plants and take care of big trees, because those are big components of that structure. And in a world with the climate changing rapidly and the need to store more carbon, an important source of storing carbon in these emerging anthropogenic residential landscapes. So thank you.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you. I have a few questions. The first one kind of goes to Fran and Tom. Can you please share research sources that other bugs are harmed with pesticides? Also, the pesticide ads claim, as natural. My favorite ones are, I got a guy across the street that comes out, he's already sprayed his trees already with EcoTree. That's the name of the company. Right there tells me it's not right, but if you have any of that research that can show that. And then the second part to that same question, what about spraying for ticks? Does that harm other insects as well?
So one of the, just as a good informational article, one of the ones that we always reference, it's blog.nwf.org, National Wildlife Federation. I believe it's from September of 2020, and it's entitled "What You Need to Know Before You Spray for Mosquitoes." And they go into that most companies use pyrethroids or pyrethrin, which does harm, and they go through all the other beneficial insects and bees that they harm, and they even call out which companies use that chemical: Mosquito Joe, Mosquito Squad, and Mosquito Authority, or just some of them. And then
a lot of the ones that say natural are using essential oils is the big thing. And now it's important to remember that essential oils, while they are natural, can be harmful. They'll use those, I think, to kill like cockroaches and bed bugs and those kind of things. Like tea tree oil is one I know is recommended for that. But they're usually used as repellents, and they're not as effective at keeping your mosquitoes away at the same time. So
I believe the same thing for ticks. It's you're not. I don't think you can really just target one.
Yeah, permethrin's a really popular chemical for treating for ticks, and I know there's one guy in one of these presentations talking about setting up like tick traps, where it was a little enclosure that the ticks would then go into, but other things, I guess, could in theory go in there, but they weren't as likely to be just indiscriminately sprayed. Yeah, that was the big thing. Is a lot of times they're just going and everything's getting hit, and there's a lot of I guess bycatch is one way to put it.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, the next question is, does any of you know of any New York native no-mow lawn seeds? You know about the no-mow mixes that's kind of popular in the Midwest. They're really good for zones just north of us. So I was just wondering if anyone knows of any natives or non-native no-mow mixes that are okay. That was a question that we had. Let's see, we had a couple other questions. Let's see. It was, I think this came for you, Tony. I think you had some question. I think you had, I'm not sure if it's Tony or Chris, sorry. I'll just throw out the question. It was the question was, I feel like these numbers have shifted though with COVID. I've heard such amazing stats on new gardeners. And so I don't remember who put up the blurb about that. There's not as many native gardeners out there. Does any of you feel like there's a new trend coming around that there seems to be more gardeners that are leaning more towards natives?
I don't have any, I don't have any, I've never run across anything that made that case.
Yeah. So I have to
or
say,
especially now, I mean, it would be awfully soon to have somebody have published something on the effects of COVID maybe, but I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know if there's solid evidence for that.
yeah, I agreed. So what has happened with our anecdotal stuff is that our Facebook pages and our programming seems to be exponentially more people coming and listening to our talks and or buying native plants. So it seems like it, but again, it's total it's total not true science. So I was just kind of curious.
I'm trying to remember. There was a stat that the New Jersey Native Plant Society threw out that at the beginning of COVID, what was it like do you remember, Tom? Like how much was it like their base tripled?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the New Jersey Native Plant Society had about like 350 members prior to 2020, and when we gave a presentation a couple months ago, it was over 900.
Yeah.
So
there's certainly a lot of there's certainly evidence that sort of people got out, especially in 2020. That the parking lots at sort of recreational areas were overflowing at certain times. I think that's because people could be outside but not inside. I think as the things die down a bit, it's probably gone back to more the way it was. But so I wouldn't be surprised there's some evidence of that, but I don't know exactly where to point to that either.
Okay, so I have a little more specific one, Tony. What would you say to someone who said viburnum isn't an invasive in my yard?
A viburnum isn't an invasive in their yard? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it really depends. Not everything that's non-native is invasive. I mean, that is a true statement. There are some things that tend not to volunteer, and that's okay. I just think that we have so many native viburnums that we can use in the landscape that are just as gorgeous as some of the non-natives. We have the viburnum prunifolium, viburnum dentatum and reconitum, the acerfolium, so the maple leaf, the arrowwoods, the prunifolium, which is I don't know why the common name is escaped. Oh, black haw. There's a lot of native viburnums that we can use. I draw my kind of inspiration for native use. I mean, I grew up near the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and my parents had these beautiful protective screens and these nice, just kind of by letting things go. We had, blackberries in the back, and we had blueberry bushes, and we had viburnum and dogwood. And in certain times you have almost blooms throughout the year when some of the viburnums come out first, and then you have the dogwoods come out in the summer, and then you get some of the the berries in the midsummer. I don't know. I'm a big proponent. So I mean, sure, you can use non-natives, and not all of them will volunteer and invade. But I guess why risk the chance? And are you going to be that diligent to follow up to see if they're going? You know, that's the tricky thing is you can guarantee that, you know, a bird's going to pick up, say, a fruiting body and deposit it somewhere else. You don't know where it's going to go, but the chances are that will happen over time, and eventually one of those seeds will be viable and make it. And so, you know, I feel like we have a lot of great natives that we can use and that are better for our wildlife, that they're just more nutritious. You know, that's my case. If we want to help backyards and wildlife and we care about the birds and other creatures using it, I think that's the way to go. I don't know if that exactly answers if that's kind of.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's good. And I'm going to tell you, you're speaking to much of the choir on online. So
yeah, I figured as much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then for Chris, I had one more. For people that live in apartments or have little access to green space, how can they contribute to enhancing local biodiversity? You know, if you're in that more urban setting, what are some suggestions on how to get some biodiversity around them?
Yeah, get involved in managing the green spaces that you like and care about. I would say, right? You don't have the ability, if you live in a apartment with shared space where you don't have control over the sole control over the landscaping. But you can get involved with land trusts, and lots of land trusts are doing more and more restoration these days, and the restoration involves maintaining early successional habitat, making sure that those habitats are dense with native plants and not non-native plants. Just as an example, there's been a big effort around southeastern Mass where I live, and I've been involved in, to restore former cranberry farms to some wetlands. But now there are efforts in several of these projects to create sort of areas of pollinator habitat within those restoration projects, for example, and those take people, and that's just an example of the kind of thing. So that would be my suggestion: get involved in the management within your region of the local natural areas and try to push for restoration where you can.
Okay, thank you very much. If Fran or Tom or Tony, if you want to jump in on that, otherwise I think I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, thank you very much. Reminder for all those that are still in line to seek, if they're seeking DEC pesticide applicators credits, must also sign out. And in the chat room, and then DEC and LACE's credits must also complete their short survey form. So thank you, gentlemen. A great set of talks, and I know I learned a bit, and so thank you very much.